Okay, let's dive in. Alcatraz. I mean, just saying the name conjures up images, doesn't it? The Rock, that infamous prison. Supposedly escape-proof?
Oh, absolutely. It's known worldwide, instantly recognizable. But the real story, it's much richer and honestly a lot more surprising than just those federal prison years.
Right. And that's really what this deep dive is all about today. We're taking the source material you've shared with us and exploring, the surprising history, what it's like now, and yeah, even looking at the potential future of Alcatraz Island.
And we've got a really good overview here from the sources. It covers the whole journey from a military fort way back when, right up to its life today as this huge tourist draw.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get into some recent news and, importantly, try to sort out some of the facts from the popular fiction that kind of surrounds it.
Oh, I know that.
So our mission for you today is really to get past the myth. We want to understand its actual significance, maybe clear up some of those persistent ideas that, Hollywood loves. And take a look at what might be next for this legendary place. Why does this little rock in San Francisco Bay still grab our imaginations so much? Let's find out.
Well, what's fascinating, and you really have to grasp this to understand Alcatraz, is that its story starts long before it was ever a prison. The island's location, strategically, that was everything.
Geography is destiny, right? Its spot in the bay was just perfect for defense.
Exactly. The sources say it was first flagged as a military reservation way back in 1850, President Millard Fillmore. And this is right in the thick of the California gold rush, so San Francisco Bay was suddenly incredibly important.
Makes sense. The U.S. Army saw that potential immediately. They built a fortress, the Citadel, had over 100 cannons there.
Yeah, it formed this crucial triangle of defense for the bay entrance, along with Fort Point and Lime Point, covering all angles.
And it wasn't just cannons. It had the West Coast's first operational lighthouse pretty early on, right?
Right.
By 1854.
That's right, guiding ships into that busy harbor. So, from the start, it was about control, about defense.
And that kind of role, that strategic importance, it naturally led to its next phase, becoming a military prison.
It did. That started back in the late 1850s.
So who were they holding there then? Not the gangsters yet, I assume.
No, definitely not the federal crowd yet. Initially, during the Civil War, it was Confederate sympathizers. Later, and this is a less known part, it held 19 Hopi men in 1895 who were resisting assimilation policies.
Wow, I didn't know that specific part.
Yeah, it's quite poignant. And also American soldiers who'd been court-martialed, some from the Philippine-American War. It officially became a military prison branch in 1907, and they built that big concrete prison, the one we mostly see today, finished around 1911.
Okay, so military fort, then military prison.
Yeah.
How does it morph into the rock that everyone thinks they know, the federal penitentiary?
That shift happened in 1933. The Army handed it over to the Department of Justice. The military didn't really need it anymore, but it's isolation. Perfect, just what they were looking for to create a new kind of place. Maximum security, minimum privilege. Designed specifically for the most dangerous, the most escape-prone inmates from the entire federal system.
Ah, okay. So the federal era kicks off August 1934 to March 1963. This is where the real infamy starts.
Precisely. Its purpose was very clear, very specific. House the guys deemed too difficult, too disruptive, or just too likely to try and escape from other places.
Right.
It's interesting, though, looking at the numbers and the sources, it never actually filled up. Its capacity was 336, but the average population hovered around 260, 275.
And this is when the famous names arrive, like Al Capone. Why Alcatraz for him specifically? What was the thinking?
Well, Capone was a problem because even from prison in Atlanta, he was still managing to run his crime syndicate. Alcatraz, with its super strict rules on communication, letters, visits, that effectively shut him down. It cut off his influence in a way other prisons just couldn't.
Okay, so it neutralized him. And then you had others like George Machine Gun Kelly, Alvin Creepy Karpis, and of course Robert Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz.
Yes, Robert Stroud. He was definitely there from 1942 to 1959. Spent a long time, too, 6 years in segregation, D-block, and then 11 years in the prison hospital.
But crucially,
and this is a major point of confusion we need to clear up right now, based on the sources. While he was at Alcatraz, that is not where he did his famous bird studies.
Ah, okay, good flag. We'll circle back to that when we hit the myths section.
Definitely.
So beyond just a freezing cold bay water, what made it so secure during those federal years?
Well, the building itself was heavily reinforced. They used 2 resistant iron bars, supposedly impossible to cut through back then. Guard towers were placed strategically for overlapping fields of fire. And the routine was incredibly strict, like 12 inmate counts or checks every single day.
12 checks a day. Wow. Constant eyes on them. And they only had those, what, 4 basic rights? Food, clothes?
Food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. That was it. Everything else, visits, library access, work assignments, even talking was a privilege, something you had to earn through good behavior.
That really paints a picture. Not necessarily brutal torture, but incredibly restrictive.
Exactly. That's often a surprise. The sources suggest basic living conditions, like having your own cell, were sometimes better than overcrowded state or federal joints. The severity was the lack of everything else, the psychological weight of that.
And that stark reality, that focus on control, leads us right into the escape attempts. This is the stuff of legends, right?
It really is. It captures the imagination. The sources say 36 inmates tried to escape in 14 separate attempts between 34 and 63.
And for most of them, the outcome was
pretty grim. Most were caught, sometimes still on the island itself, or they were presumed drowned in those really treacherous currents and freezing water.
But there's the one, the big one. 1962, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence.
Yes, that's the one that fuels the whole mystery. It was incredibly elaborate. They spent months planning it, used homemade tools.
Like that drill from a vacuum cleaner motor.
Exactly. Yeah. To widen the air vents in their cells. And then famously, those dummy heads they made.
The papier-mâché heads. Made from soap, concrete dust, real hair. Incredibly lifelike to fool the guards during the night counts.
They were. And they got out of their cells, out of the main building, and down to the water's edge with a makeshift raft.
But the key point here, and the FBI source is clear on this, is the lack of definite proof about what happened next. Did they survive?
Exactly. Their bodies were never recovered. The FBI officially concluded they likely drowned the bay as incredibly dangerous, foggy, cold, strong currents. But without finding bodies, without concrete proof, they made it to shore and survived.
The speculation just continues forever.
Precisely. And that's why saying no one ever escaped is tricky. They did escape the prison building itself and got off the island. Whether they survived that escape is the enduring mystery.
Fascinating. Keeps the legend alive. So, okay, if it was supposedly so secure, holding the worst of the worst, why did it close down in 1963? It wasn't just because of that one escape attempt weakening its image, was it?
No, that 62 escape definitely didn't help the escape-proof reputation, and it probably contributed to the timing. But the main reason cited in our sources, they were much more practical. It really boiled down to economics and the crumbling infrastructure.
Economics? You mean it was expensive to run?
Extremely expensive.
Yeah.
Like ridiculously so. Back in 1959, the sources say it cost $10.10 per prisoner per day. Compare that to about $3 per day at other federal prisons then.
Wait, $10.10 in 1959 money. That's, let me think. Adjusting for inflation, that's got to be well over $100 a day today, right? Per inmate.
Yeah, easily. Astronomical costs. And a massive chunk of that was just the logistics of being on an island.
Right. Everything had to come in by boat.
Everything. Food, supplies, fuel, staff, even fresh water for a time. All by barge. That's expensive, inefficient, and totally dependent on weather. Much harder than running a prison on the mainland.
Plus, the buildings themselves were just getting beaten up by the salty air, the fog.
Exactly. The sources mention constant corrosive damage. By the early 60s, the place needed massive repairs. Estimates were around $5 million back then.
Which today would be, what, 50 million? More?
Easily. Probably more. Just for essential upkeep. So you combine the huge daily running costs with the massive bill for repairs. It just became unsustainable.
So the closure on March 21st, 1963, it wasn't some dramatic failure, really. It was more about the balance sheet and, well, the salt spray.
That's a great way to put it. It just wasn't economically viable anymore, especially compared to building or maintaining modern prisons on the mainland.
Okay, so the last prisoners leave. What happens then? The island doesn't just sit there empty, right?
No, and this is another really unique and important part of its story.
Yeah.
A few years after the prison closed, in November 1969, the island was occupied.
By Native American activists.
That's right. A group calling themselves Indians of All Tribes. They stayed for about 19 months, until June 1971.
What was their aim? What were they trying to achieve?
It was a major protest against U.S. government policies towards Native Americans, asserting treaty rights they argued gave them claim to unused federal land. They wanted to establish things like a university, a cultural center, a museum there.
And that occupation ended when they were removed.
Yes, federal authorities eventually removed them. But that period, the occupation of Alcatraz, is a hugely significant event in modern Native American history and a critical chapter for the island itself. Post-prison.
And then not long after that, it becomes a park. That seems like a big pivot.
It was. In 1972, the year after the occupation ended, Alcatraz became part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Management officially passed to the National Park Service, the NPS.
Which brings us pretty much up to today. It went from this symbol of ultimate confinement to, well, a massive tourist destination.
Exactly. It's now a museum, really.
Yeah.
A place millions visit. You can go explore the cell blocks, see the guard towers, get a feel for the atmosphere. The audio tours are fantastic, by the way.
And the NPS doesn't just focus on the federal prison years now, do they?
No, they do a great job of presenting the whole layered history. You learn about the military fort era, the really powerful story of the Native American occupation, and even the natural side.
The wildlife, like the birds.
Yeah, especially the seabirds, like pelicans. Which is funny because the island's original Spanish name, La Isla de los Alcatraces, actually means Island of the Pelicans.
Huh. Full circle, back to the birds, but not the Birdman's birds this time.
Exactly. And clearly, it's huge for San Francisco tourism now. Millions visit every year. Sources say maybe 4,000 people a day. It's a big deal economically.
And it's not like the history is finished being written, right? We saw something in the sources about some really recent tech being used there. 3D mapping.
Yes, that's super interesting. Just this year, April 2025, a team led by Pete Kelsey used things like robots, lasers, drones, really cutting-edge stuff to create this incredibly detailed 3D map of the whole island, even areas nobody could really access before.
Wow. What did they find? Or what are they hoping to find?
Well, it's revealing super precise details about, say, the route the 1962 escapees might have taken, how the structures were actually built. It gives historians amazing new data. And, it just keeps the public interest going.
It's amazing how new tech can unlock secrets from a place we thought we knew so well. It definitely remains this global symbol, doesn't it? All those movies. Escape from Alcatraz, The Birdman again, remembering the movie title versus the facts, The Rock.
Its cultural impact is just massive, undeniable.
Okay, this feels like the perfect moment to really dig into those myths we've kind of touched on, because for you listening, sorting out the Hollywood version from the actual facts is probably key.
Absolutely. Let's tackle some of the big ones head on based on what the sources tell us.
Okay, myth number 1. Alcatraz was America's Devil's Island. Just this uniquely brutal, inhumane place, awful conditions.
Yeah, that's the popular image.
Yeah.
But the facts, according to the sources, pretty different. In terms of basic living standards, Alcatraz was often better than many other federal prisons back then.
Better? How so?
Well, every inmate had their own cell, no dangerous overcrowding, they got decent food, clothing, medical care. The sources even say some inmates in worse conditions elsewhere actually requested transfers to Alcatraz because of those basics.
Wait, hold on. People asked to go to Alcatraz because conditions were better. That completely turns the usual story on its head.
It does for a lot of people.
Yeah.
The harshness wasn't necessarily about filth or starvation like in some prisons. It was the extreme isolation, the lack of privileges, the psychological pressure, but the baseline conditions. Often better than the alternative, surprisingly.
Okay, that's a huge clarification. Myth number 2. Nobody ever escaped from Alcatraz.
Yeah.
Full stop.
Right, the escape-proof line. The fact here is more nuanced. While no escapee was ever confirmed to have survived and made it to freedom permanently, that 1962 escape by Morris and the Anglins, it's still unresolved.
Because their bodies were never found.
Exactly. The FBI sources are clear. No concrete proof of survival, but also no bodies recovered. That lack of definite proof is why the mystery lives on. So saying no one ever escaped isn't quite right. They did breach the prison walls and get off the island structure itself. Their ultimate fate is the unknown.
Got it. The debate is really about survival after the escape, not the escape itself. Okay. Myth number 3. Robert Stroud, the Birdman, studied his birds while he was at Alcatraz.
Fact. Nope. Almost entirely a Hollywood invention, fueled by the movie title. He did all this speculative bird research, wrote his book at Leavenworth Prison in Kansas. That's where he was allowed birds for a while.
Not at Alcatraz.
Absolutely not. By the time he got to Alcatraz in 1942, he was strictly forbidden from having birds. The nickname stuck because of the book, and especially the 1962 movie, but the bird science happened long before and elsewhere.
Okay, another big one debunked. Movie title, historical fact for his time there. Myth number 4. Alcatraz was basically only for the big-name gangsters. Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, that crowd.
Fact. While it definitely held some very notorious figures like them, the sources say most inmates weren't famous at all. They were guys transferred from other federal prisons because they were considered extremely dangerous, violent, chronic escape risks, or because they'd caused major trouble, like bribing guards elsewhere.
So it wasn't about fame, it was about being difficult, problem inmates.
Exactly. It was designed to handle the system's most challenging prisoners, famous or not.
That really helps paint a clearer picture than the usual gangster movie version. It wasn't necessarily the worst conditions, but it was for managing the toughest, most escape-prone individuals.
Precisely. It served a specific function within the Bureau of Prison system at that time.
Okay, so let's pivot and look forward now, based on what the sources are telling us. There was some recent news, right? Something about potentially reopening Alcatraz as a prison.
Yes, that's come up recently, according to the sources. In May 2025, former President Donald Trump apparently expressed an intention to potentially reopen Alcatraz.
And the sources mention his reasoning behind that.
Yes. The sources state he framed it as a place for potentially housing the worst criminals and illegal aliens, and described it as being a powerful symbol of law and order.
Okay. And the sources say discussions were initiated.
The sources indicate the White House started talks with the Bureau of Prisons, BOP, and the Department of the Interior, which oversees the National Park Service, and that the BOP is assessing next steps. The proposal mentioned in the source also includes expanding or rebuilding it to modern standards.
Okay, so that's the proposal reported in the sources. But immediately after that, the sources also lay out some pretty significant hurdles to that idea, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. The challenges are described as quite substantial. Top of the list, cost. We already talked about how it was 3 times more expensive historically.
Right.
Modernizing it now, maybe even rebuilding parts, to meet current BOP security and humane confinement standards. Especially with all that salt air damage. We're likely talking hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, minimum.
And the logistics haven't changed. Still an island. Still need boats for everything.
Exactly. Yeah. The BOP runs 16 high-security prisons already, and they've actually closed some facilities recently, partly due to costs. Reopening Alcatraz means bringing back those expensive, complex barge operations for every single thing: supplies, staff, inmates, everything.
Plus, it's not just empty federal land anymore. It's a really popular national park.
Correct. That's a huge factor. Transferring it back from the National Park Service to the Bureau of Prisons would require major policy changes, maybe even new laws. And the sources anticipate strong pushback.
From who?
Environmental groups protecting the wildlife, historians wanting to preserve the site, tourism groups, basically anyone invested in it remaining a national park and museum, which generates significant revenue and cultural value as it is.
So, based only on what the sources present, the massive costs, the logistical nightmare, the likely political and public opposition, what do they suggest about the likelihood of this actually happening anytime soon?
Based only on those challenges laid out in the sources, they suggest it's pretty unlikely without a huge amount of dedicated funding and very strong political backing to overcome all those obstacles. Plus, the BOP seems focused on more modern mainland facilities, like a new prison mentioned in Kentucky. Reopening Alcatraz doesn't seem like a practical priority for them right now, according to the analysis in the sources.
Okay, so if reopening as a prison looks like a long shot based on the sources, what other future directions do they mention? What else could happen with Alcatraz?
Well, they mostly suggest enhancing its current role under the National Park Service. Things like using that new 3D mapping tech for better virtual tours or educational programs.
Leaning into the museum and history aspect.
Exactly. Expanding exhibits, maybe focusing more on the less told stories like the Native American occupation, continuing the environmental conservation work with the seabirds and other wildlife, and just fostering more historical and archaeological research using these new tools, basically doubling down on its value as a historical site and natural space.
That makes a lot of sense, building on what it already is. Okay, let's try to wrap things up by kind of balancing the ledger based on everything we've covered from the sources. What were the main pros and cons of Alcatraz historically as a prison, and what are they now as a historical site?
Okay. Historically, as a prison, a perceived benefit was deterrence, sending a message during high crime periods. Its isolation was effective at neutralizing dangerous inmates like Capone, preventing them from running things outside or corrupting other prisons. And maybe for some, the strict structure offered a kind of discipline.
And currently, the benefits seem pretty clear. Tourism.
Huge. Major revenue for San Francisco and the NPS. Millions of visitors. Immense educational value. People learn about prison history, Native American rights, the environment. It has this global cultural legacy, thanks to media. And the NPS protects its wildlife.
Okay, drawbacks. Historically, cost has to be number one.
Absolutely. Those crippling operating and maintenance costs were the main historical drawback. Also, its small size, it could only ever hold a tiny percentage of the federal prison population. And while basic needs were met, that intense psychological isolation was definitely a negative factor for inmates.
And the current drawbacks. Maintaining an old structure in that environment must still be tough.
For sure, ongoing maintenance costs from the salt air are still a big challenge for the MPS. Accessibility is another practical issue. You have to take a ferry, tickets sell out. And then there's the potential risk, as we discussed, that proposals to repurpose it could threaten its historical integrity and its value as a museum and park.
It's such a complex place. So much history layered onto one small island.
It truly is. And just to remind you, everything we've talked through today comes directly from those sources provided at Britannica, the FBI, BOP, NBCBayAreaHistory.com, and those X posts about recent discussions. We've really tried to stick to the evidence presented there.
Okay, wow. That was quite the deep dive. We went from military outpost through those notorious prison years, the really significant Native American occupation, and right up to its current life as this major historical site.
And hopefully we've helped show that its closure was more about dollars and cents and crumbling concrete than just escapes or it being the worst prison ever.
Yeah, and cleared up some of those myths around escapes and folks like Robert Stroud. The real story, based on the sources, is often more nuanced and maybe even more interesting than the Hollywood version.
We hope so.
So hopefully this has given you, listening, a much clearer picture of what Alcatraz truly was and what it is now. It's just such a layered story: history, crime, isolation, civil rights, conservation, even current political debate swirls around it.
Which leads to maybe a final thought for you to consider, something that kind of emerges when you pull together all these threads from the sources.
Yeah.
As you picture that island today, with thousands visiting daily, how do we really balance the immense value of preserving that complex history and its natural environment benefits we see right now with these recurring arguments, however challenging, for putting it back to some kind of practical, maybe even correctional reuse?
What does Alcatraz's whole evolution, fort, prison, protest site, park tell us about how our society's priorities change over time when it comes to punishment, remembering history, and deciding what we do with significant public places?
Yeah, something to think about definitely as you consider the long shadow and the enduring legacy of the Rock.